From Microbe TV, this is TWiEVO, This Week in Evolution, episode 110, live streamed on January 22nd, 2025. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast on the biology behind what makes us tick. Joining me today from Salt Lake City, Nels LD.
Hey, Vincent, greetings from chilly LD Lab Studios here in Salt Lake City, feeling the cold sting of winter.
What temperature do you have?
Well, we've come up a few degrees, so we're north of 0 Fahrenheit, but we were dipping down there yesterday.
Oh, you're tropical, man.
Yeah, it sounds like the East Coast. Yeah, what are you up against?
Oh, today it's minus 14 C.
Yeah,
now, I know that many places are colder. I was talking to a lady in Colorado, and she was even worse.
Mm-hmm.
But here in the Northeast, we're not used to this, at least not in the New York City area. And it really hurts. So when you breathe in, your nose hurts from the cold air, you know?
Yeah. You're describing my childhood.
That's how it was in Minnesota.
Yeah, it's cold there. I think they're in the, I didn't do the conversion, but approaching minus 30 Fahrenheit before you even get into the wind chill.
Whoa, that's hard.
Yep.
Did you get used to it?
Yeah, there's always, historically, less so these days, but there's always a week or two in January where you just kind of hunker down and stay inside for a few days. And then it usually comes right back up to, and then, the good news is when you go through a real freeze like the one you're in the middle of, when it comes back to sort of regular temps, it feels balmy. You're going to be out there in a t-shirt and, board shorts before you know it. It's, so you kind of adapt as you go.
Well, we have to adapt. We have no choice. Welcome, everybody. And thank you. We have one moderator here today, Barb Mack. UK. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry we've been switching the times around lately. Things happen.
Yep.
We'll try and keep it constant going forward, right?
That's right. This one's on me with a doctor's appointment later, checkup later today. And so we move things around. But yeah, I agree. We're a couple hours early, but luckily it's all recorded. And if you catch us, if you're coming in late, just catch up and we'll be back. And I think we found a pretty good time zone, so to speak, that will be hovering around most times, which is 2 hours on from where we're starting today. But thank you, Barb Mack, for being here. Thank you others for arriving early.
Tell us where you're from. There are about 20 people here. Tell us where you're from. Look at Brendan is in Salt Lake City.
There we go. Welcome.
Not too far from you.
Not too far. And I can confirm that forecast or that
cold and pretty clear
observation. Yep.
Peter is in London. It's 4C and damp. I'd like to have 4C.
Soon enough, it'll be back.
Jeremy is in Seattle. 24F. That's pretty cold.
Crisp. That is crisp.
It's very crisp. Yeah. And Mark is in Helsinki. Plus 2C is pretty mild too, right?
That's right. Yeah. Above freezing. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you back.
Gary's in Colorado, 22F. It's still freezing, right? It's cold.
Yeah, that's around where we were. We dipped into the zeros and a little at the ski resorts yesterday. I think it was quite chilly, but here we are.
Tona is in. Well, I know Tona's in Long Island. Yeah, it's cold today, Tona. I know.
There you go.
Share your pain. But Daniel Griffin says as long as there's water, he'll go sailing. So even in these kind of temperatures, he doesn't mind sailing.
Good idea. I'm an advocate of this too. So one of my science mentors here at Utah, Jerry Kaplan, who's now retired, he and I usually go fly fishing in the winter.
Wow.
Because get out on the water, bundle up, and the advantage is the streams or rivers are basically empty because no one's out there, and so you've got the whole place to yourself. It's really invigorating. Yeah.
Claire is in the UK. Welcome.
Welcome. Good to see you.
Joseph is in southwestern Ontario. I bet it's cold up there.
I think that's a fair bet.
What do you think of Joseph of becoming the 51st state? I would suggest you don't do it. You don't want it. Don't do it. Say no.
I don't think that one's on the menu.
Panama already told us to go screw ourselves.
Of course.
Which I think is great.
That's the right impulse. Yes.
So Barb Mac said there's a foot of snow in New Orleans today. I heard it snowed down there.
Yeah, wild. I saw some pictures of that in the Garden District, and wow, yeah, not usual.
This is a problem when cities who don't usually get snow, they're not prepared. They don't have snow clearing machines,
And the trees and plants and animals aren't so prepared either. That's a pretty big shock to the system. And plus, we want all that snow here in the mountains. We'll take that and add it to our, ski resorts. So
Joseph says definite no to statehood for Canada. Yes, don't get near us. We're so screwed up right now.
You're in good company on that one, Joseph. Yep.
Oh, Bob LD is in Johnson City. I wonder who that is.
There's a familiar face. Fantastic.
Nice to have you.
My father is here. Good
Johnson
to see you.
City, I've been there.
That's right. This was the venue for TWiEVO 100, Vincent.
Yeah.
We all hung out at the Science Mill.
Cool. It was a little warmer then.
It's a little warmer. That's right.
March last year, March 24. And I wish it could be that warm right now.
That's right.
John is in Eden Prairie.
Heat wave.
Where's minus 4C?
Oh.
You know Eden Prairie?
I do, of course. Yeah, that's one of the near suburbs of Minneapolis. And 24, it looks like you're out of the ice box and back to sort of business as usual.
Tona says she's waiting for me to rant and yell about WHO. Actually, it's
We'll
my pick. It's my pick of the week. We're going to talk about that. Oh my gosh,
we've got some ranting to do here.
I mean, all these individual proclamations are disgusting.
Yeah,
I mean,
really,
you got the WHO, which we'll talk about, and then denying transgender people any rights. What the hell is that about? Because you think it's not right. You think it's not right. Therefore, the whole freaking country has to listen to you. It's totally ridiculous. Oh, we have another moderator here. Vanity, welcome.
Good.
Thanks for coming.
Welcome. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, boy, this is crazy times, but we're going to keep podcasting, and we'll talk about this.
Of course.
By the way, folks, 8 p.m. tonight, Eastern office hours. This is a crazy day today because we have this, and then at 4 p.m. I teach my virology class. So first class of the year.
Nice.
I have to get on a subway and brave the cold, and oh my gosh.
Good for you.
Then I have to rush home and do office hours at 8, so I might be a little late. I don't know. The trains are weird because of the weather.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Emily Ray, good morning. Welcome.
Welcome
to TWiEVO.
Yeah.
And Patrick is in Bremerton, Washington, on the shores of Puget Sound.
That's right. Good area. Good spot in the country.
And it's
one of my favorites.
Not bad. Not bad at all, right? 33.
Yeah.
And by the way, Puget Sound, University of Puget Sound must be on Puget Sound, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. PSU, Puget Sound University. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's in Tacoma.
Correct. I think that sounds right. Yeah.
And so
there's
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say there's many great institutions of learning up in dotting around the Puget Sound. The obvious ones in and around Seattle, but then as you go north, you've got Western Washington University up near Bellingham. As you're saying, Vincent, PSU, Puget Sound University to the south in Tacoma. Absolutely beautiful area of the country.
Mark Martin. That's where Mark Martin is from.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Microbial Matters, one of the...
Matters Microbial.
Matters Microbial. Thank you.
Yeah,
one of the allied podcasts in the Microbe TV collection.
Yep. Yeah. But we do have science for you today. But before we start, I want to remind you that if you enjoy these programs, And I think you'll enjoy them more as we get into this
Into the
administration,
weeds. Yeah.
which tries to squelch
Mm.
science.
Yeah.
We'll keep trying to explain things to you and tell you what's going on and so forth. We are not afraid to speak out.
We're
I've
here.
actually already been told by many people that I should be quiet and lay low.
No,
No, I'm not going to be quiet and lay low.
of course not.
Sorry, I'm going to speak out, and I'm sure all my podcast hosts will. Well, it's funny,
Yeah.
Nels, on TWiV, when I get
Yeah.
political, everybody gets silent. All the other hosts get silent.
Yeah. I'm not. Totally. Well, yeah. We're gonna dig into this a little bit.
But you don't get
As
silent. You get into it, right?
No, yeah, of course I get into it, but I share that impulse. As scientists, um, you know, overgeneralizing here, but into many extents, you've got a group of thoughtful, introverted people who are trained in many cases. We're trained in many cases to be, careful about what we go on the record
Yeah, sure.
about. And so I think, a lot of scientists are finding themselves in this sort of confusing space. One of the gifts of doing TWiEVO now for 7-8 years is to let go of some of that apprehension and thoughtfulness, if you will, even in a sense, and to just say what you think and to go on the record and to try to decouple a little bit of the science brain of trying to get the facts and details and all the variables right from regular human being brain of like, this is messed up. I think I'm going to say something about this. And I think this is a moment in particular for very obvious reasons that we'll be touching on. In addition to the science the research that we'll consider, to be a little more upfront and to do that as bigger as communities coming together in new and different ways, and to grow that. This is in this moment, I can't think of anything more American than talking to each other, assembling with each other, and taking advantage of the rights that we have in order to protect them as well, to point out what's going on, and to each try to be a bigger part of the conversation. But yeah, it's going to be awkward. But luckily scientists are pretty familiar with that space too, when it relates to sort of social interactions. Awkwardness is kind of the stock and trade of let's embrace our awkwardness.
Yeah, we are awkward.
And
sure.
move forward as best we can.
FSM the dog is here from Wales.
Great. Fantastic.
Welcome
back. Yeah.
All right. So microbe.tv/contribute. Many of you have helped us out in this donation season, but just keep us in mind. We do need your support to do these programs. I'm always thinking about how we can keep everything going, so help us out. Microbe.tv/contribute. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Interesting paper we have today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So today, Vincent, our paper, we're back with the ants, the insects, and sort of the evolutionary complexity that shows up in their behavior. Paper from July, Current Biology. Thanks for putting it up there. Wound-dependent leg amputations to combat infections in an ant society. So the carpenter ants here, Vincent, are going from carpenters to surgeons.
My gosh.
And performing amputations on injured nestmates is sort of the take-home message. So let's pause for a moment and talk about who did the work here. So first author, Eric Frank, who's now running his lab at the University of Würzburg in Germany, and is taking the work forward. And so speaking of sort of awkwardness or awkward moments or worse, so I hesitated to pick this paper, not because of the science, which is really interesting, and I think we'll have a lot of fun digging in, but because of the senior author who's no longer in science, Laurent Keller. And so, awkwardness, controversy, or worse, Keller was fired from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland about a year and a half ago under allegations of sexual abuse. And I don't know the details, but this was one of those moments actually that we were just touching on, Vincent, of my first scientific impulse was to maybe, let's skip over this paper and not talk about it. But I decided to sort of fight that impulse because, there's 5 other scientists
Yeah,
who are
that's right.
authors on this paper.
It's their work. Yeah.
It's their work. And Eric Frank in particular, who's now taking his postdoctoral work and using this, tending to wounds in ants and this really important evolutionarily complex behavior. And so I think that's one of those moments, right, where a scientist, our first impulse might be like, oh, well, that's kind of awkward or worse. And so let's kind of just set that aside. But, this is maybe obviously a very small example and a little different than some of the political stuff. But I think it's of the same stripe in that this is a moment to, walk through uncomfortable spaces and have these discussions as we as humans try to move forward in imperfect ways, etc.
I didn't know that this was an issue, but I thought interesting this Eric Frank. He puts his Twitter handle here, right? Look,
yeah, that's right, on X. Formerly Twitter. Yeah, that's right.
I've never seen that before on an author list, right? You got all his affiliations, and then number 6 is X, which. X is a dicey place nowadays.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
I just went and looked at my account, which I haven't posted to since the spring of 22, but it has 187,000 followers.
Yeah, but a lot of those have hollowed out. They're no longer people; they're robots.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
So the other thing that's interesting about this paper in Current Biology, it goes right into results and discussion.
Yeah, so I agree. So this is in their report format, and a more kind of really impactful observation that's really interesting and inspiring.
I see.
So, but in that shorter form, and we'll talk about that. It's okay with me. This is one of those papers where just the result is so surprising and exciting that then I think what it does then is it's really inspiring. It sort of spurs your curiosity and leads to questions ahead. And we'll talk through, and I don't think it will take us too long. Famous last words, but we'll talk through the science, and then would love to have as our crew assembles here. We're approaching 40 listeners. Would love to have questions, feedback, impressions, as we think about what this work means, how it might move science forward, thinking specifically about sort of evolution of behavioral traits, which is a really exciting but also difficult to get your hands around. Here's a really cool new system. So Vincent, we've talked about ants before many times on TWiEVO, one of our favorite topics, and so also gives me a chance to highlight some science heroes working in the field who are not only incredible scientists, but incredible people. And so first up on our menu was a really fun interview with Corey Moreau. So I think she was at the Field Museum in Chicago when we caught up with her a few years ago. This is on TWiEVO episode 13, This Week in Ants. She's now at Cornell. I remember, Vincent, you were about to try to launch a podcast exclusively about ants.
Yeah. Was she the person we were thinking about?
Yes, and she's an incredible advocate for ants and really cool ecological science in general, has a pretty busy with a day job, more than a single day job, but would be obviously an incredible podcast host as well.
Yeah,
then
I remember that.
Vincent, that was really fun. She's great. It's been a year.
And she does a lot of field work. Well, you work on ants, you do field work a lot, right? So
exactly, and that's going to come on to the radar here as we get into this paper. Next up, at your old Racaniello lab studios, the recording center, you hosted Dustin Rubenstein, one of your colleagues from Columbia. I think that was off. This is TWiEVO number 43, Social Evolution with a Side of Shrimp. Dustin was telling us about these little shrimp that live in colonies among the coral or among sponges in the ocean, and how they exhibit some complex social behaviors that he was developing as a model system. Dustin had invited me to a conference, kind of a working conference on social evolution out at Columbia that turned into a review paper. that we published together as we sort of grappled with some of the complexities. Can you see some of the hallmarks of social evolution in the genomes, whether it's an ant or in his case, a shrimp? And that work continues. And then 2 episodes so far from Daniel Cronauer's lab, TWiEVO 62, the army ant. So Daniel at Rockefeller in your neighborhood there published a book on army ants and has been pioneering really exciting work, bringing genetic tools to the army ant, the raider ant system as well. And so he's been on our menu for thinking about bringing evolutionary ideas and concepts, social evolution, but to bringing that into experimental science as well, both through genomics, but I think even more potentially powerfully through these genetic techniques, being able to manipulate genes and see the impact on some of these social behaviors. And that brings us to another episode, which was from some of the lab members of the Cronauer lab, Buck, Sean, and Sylvia. And my favorite, still my all-time favorite title of a TWiEVO episode. This is number 18. And your title, Vincent, Raiders of the Lost Orco, where they disrupted the orco gene in raider ants. It all came together in that title. And
my last good title.
Yeah, it's almost 100 episodes ago, man. You gotta raise the bar here a little bit. So anyway, so lots of past TWiEVOs where we've thought about ants, and here we are again. It's not a surprise given all of the interesting biology in the system and then its potential to advance the system in experimental ways. Okay, so here the authors pick up the case with wound healing in ant colonies. And they first note that some animal species treat wounds with antibiotics and antimicrobials. And I think that's pretty well known for the ants. They may, through specialized glands, make antimicrobials and sort of tend to each other. The leaf-cutting ants, of course, that are cultivating fungi are also sort of these pharmacists that go in and make sure that bacteria don't overwhelm their fungal colony, or their fungal clones, which they're using to feed themselves. And so the obvious, other species that does this activity, treating with antibiotics or antimicrobials, is our own. And honestly, there's a few, I don't know of others. There are a few others. This one, though, it brings another sort of medical intervention to the animal kingdom, which is amputations. And so it turns out in the Florida carpenter ants, which is the topic of this study, Camponotus floridinus is the scientific name, have lost some of those specialized glands that might make antimicrobials. And so I think that's where the authors started, was to then ask, okay, well, in these wound healing conditions, if they're not treating these wounds as has been observed in other ant societies, then what are they doing? And so immediately, I guess, through observations and also interventions, so they're going in and injuring the legs of some of these carpenter ants and then observing them to see how their nest mates respond. And so if you injure the leg of a healthy worker ant, Florida carpenter ant, they, over the course of a few hours, I think it can be between 5 or 6 hours, in the process of amputating a leg, by the way, takes 40 minutes or so, or an hour.
That's amazing.
Isn't that wild?
It's crazy.
And so it reminds me, I have a colleague here at Utah's where we, it kind of brings you back to those sort of childhood days of practicing science where you're kind of, you have magnifying glasses and you're messing around with ants. That kind of put me in that mind when like the authors are sort of injuring legs and then putting them back and seeing what's going on here. So my colleague says, as he's reading applications for potential prospective grad students, there's sort of 2 categories. This is, of course, overgeneralizing, but that relate to ants. So the first category are people who are hoping to cure a disease that their aunt is suffering from. That comes out in the sort of personal essays. And the second one is you're just curious, and when you were growing up, you were messing with ants. And so those are the 2 ants of the sort of, 2 lanes, right, of scientific sort of growth. somehow. So here we're obviously in the second lane, but it gets very like the details here get pretty interesting in a hurry, right? So it turns out that those nestmates, if they were going to amputate a leg, it depends on where the injury happened. So if the leg is injured or there's a wound in the femur, so if you go from the
Let's
tip
put a picture.
the,
We'll put a picture of this up
yeah,
here.
that's better. Yeah. There we go. So, yeah. So we have the femur. We've got an ant leg stretched out there.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to the cross sections in a few minutes here. But so there's the femur. If that part of the leg is injured, then the ants will amputate at the trochanter.
There, right there. That red
right
line.
there.
Yeah.
Yep. So they go upstream, which makes sense if you're going to intervene here at the base of the leg. However, if they injured at the tibia level, then the ants will still do sort of wound care, and we'll talk about what that might mean, but they won't amputate. And it's almost like a binary switch here. It's either a yes or a no. The numbers are that they put in the paper are somewhat small, but it's pretty convincing, at least from my perspective, that there's a pretty clear difference in behavior depending on where this is where the injury is experimentally put. Yeah.
So this, it's what's amazing to me. It takes like an hour to amputate, and the ant is sitting there, no problem, right? It's not struggling or trying to get away. I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe they're used to this process, right?
Yeah. So coevolution, right? So, and there's in this behavior, it's not just sort of the surgeons who are doing the work. It's also the patient who is allowing that to happen. And we see, I think we see examples of that in the animal kingdom, some charismatic examples. So like cleaner fishes, cleaner wrasse, where you'll see a big reef fish open its mouth and allow these other fish to come in and clean out all of the parasites. So in that case, that coevolution is happening, or symbiosis is happening between two different species. But I think, some of the rules or how the rules apply for the same species is a really interesting question. And so, yeah.
So these, once they amputate the leg, these ants are fine?
For the most part, yes. So I don't,
because they have 2, 4, 6 legs, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So
they still have 5.
You can lose one, and so the interesting experiment, which they didn't do, would be to cut off another one. What would they do?
Yeah, agree. How many? How far?
Injure another one? Right? Would they fix it again, or would they say goodbye?
Exactly. And I think that gets at some of the, it's a, as you pointed out, it's a short, the results and discussion are together. It's kind of a short report, but this is the kind of study that you just can't help yourself to think about all these other sort of questions. So if you, like you're saying, if you do 2 legs or 3 legs, are they continuing to do that? And that sort of gets at the complexity of the behavior and what's the motivation or, the sort of motivation for it. So, we'll talk about, they'll bring in another party here, which is an infectious microbe, a pathogen. But is the reason to do this to save your ant buddy or to save the colony from your ant buddy spreading an infection throughout the thing, right? And and again, I think thinking about it, stepping back and probably conceptualizing it as group behavior as opposed to, sort of an altruistic, let's save our one buddy. For I think maybe the first case is a little more evolutionarily plausible than the second, but really fascinating. Okay, and it's not the decision-making process here on both sides is not just sort of like, oh yeah, let's just do this and go on. This is hours of work that are being put into the wound care. So I would in a longer report, or if we were talking to Eric Frank or the author here, they describe the process as licking. The ants come in to an injured nestmate and start licking the wound using their mouth parts, and that process, can take a really long time. And as you're pointing out, Vincent, it's dependent on the whether it's at the tibia or the femur. Yeah. And so even though they aren't amputating at the tibia, they're spending hours licking, probing with their mouth parts, intervening in ways that turn out to turn the tide to save the ants in some cases, even without the amputation.
So Nels, when let me bring this picture back up. So when they put an injury in the femur,
Yeah,
do they actually cut the leg off, or do they just like break it?
good question. I don't think I don't remember. I didn't spend a lot of time in the methods section. But so the source of the injury, how dramatic the injury was, I don't remember. Is there actually, if you scroll up, Vincent, I think they have a diagram or two of the ants kind of behaving with each other. Here it is.
Yeah, there's this thing here. I
And
mean, it
so,
looks to me like they cut off.
yeah, that's right. So
So
I
then,
think you're right.
so then we're just dealing with this little stub. So why bother?
Yeah. So why bother? So, and actually, this gives us a moment so you can see in the beneath that diagram, if it's a femur injury, this
Yeah.
is I think the percent of that get amputated, whether it's infected or sterile. And so that'll come into play here in a minute. But that contrasts to the tibia injuries that are in teal, where you can basically see they really don't amputate at any percentage, in contrast to the femur injuries there. So, but getting to your question about the, the stub. So if you go back down to that diagram, we're kind of jumping around, which is fine. It's a pretty short paper. We can almost see the whole thing there. So this cross sections, these micro CTs, are taking images of what's going on.
So these are CAT scans, folks.
That's right. Ant cat. It's probably the first ant cat scan that many of us have seen. And so right in the middle, the big one is the femur injury site. And so the key sort of channel here, conduit. So a lot of the bulk there is muscle bundles.
Yeah.
But then at the very top in panel C is a hemolymph channel.
Yeah.
And you can see it's very small relative to, on the right there is the tibia. So going farther down, and now it's a lot less muscle and a lot more hemolymph. And so the idea they put forward, based on the behavior they're observing, and also, the outcomes, is that if your injury, if the injury is at the tibia level, because there's so much access to the hemolymph,
right.
the time it takes to amputate, which is hours, by then, whatever infection has started, it's gained access to the, all of the blood, the circulatory system, basically, of the ant. And so amputating at that point, it's sort of too late to block the infection. And that's in contrast to femur injury, where because the channel is so small, that these there's enough time so that to block the infection before it can get started through the strategy of amputation. Yeah, that's the idea. I think, not totally formally proven, but is very consistent with the data that they present here.
Okay. There are a couple of questions here that are
great. Yeah, let's dive in.
in. So Elizabeth wants to know, how could an ant be accustomed to an amputation? Right. So a single ant, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you couldn't be on a single ant level, right?
Couldn't be on a single ant level.
So one ant couldn't be accustomed to it because they've never done it before.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a population-based thing.
Oh, for sure. So how is this, I think, or maybe another way of framing the question is, how is this encoded somehow?
Yeah, custom is not the right word, yeah. But obviously the ant is sitting there while the worker is sawing away its leg, right?
Yeah. So there's somehow encoded in the behavior of the ants. And this is like a big gap in our knowledge. So and to kind of frame where the study brings us, this is the first, I think, convincing or first formal recognition of this behavior at all. And so then this opens exactly, I think, Elizabeth, your question is perfect, which is, how is this possible? And that's sort of the gap in knowledge that I think is like, it just really spurs your curiosity. So how could these, animals with relatively simple brains, but this collective kind of, behavior, and there's all kinds of examples of complex behaviors that we've sort of been hinting at, but this is sort of the newest one on the block. How could you encode that? Like, so what is it about the wiring of the neurons or the brain circuits that allow this behavior to happen? And so, as an evolutionary biologist, first I think you step back, and I think we can stay squarely within the bounds of Darwinian random mutation, natural selection. But then I think what this system and what behavioral evolution in general sort of gets you to is like, you see these things and it's really complicated. And it's like, well, how do I, as a reductionist or experimentalist, how do we get to the basis of how this works? And that's tough. So as as Dustin Rubenstein was hosting this meeting, it was a few years ago now, and we were sort of grappling with some of these ideas. I think what was clear is that we have, we can sequence the genomes of ants like the Florida carpenter ant, and we can see sort of hallmarks in really closely related species, some that have the behaviors, others that don't. And so that's sort of the first comparative approach, is you'd want to know who is the closest relative of the Florida carpenter ants that don't amputate their nest mates. And so then that might start to get at, how did they become accustomed to it? It's you sort of the closest neighbors that aren't, and then work backwards from there. What is different about them genetically? And then, even what's different about their neuroanatomy in some of these cases, and to try to sort of integrate that information together. This is the work of science going forward. And why I think this moment in science is so exciting is that we have the tools and the resources that we've never had before in terms of the molecular level to take these very simple observations, but surprising observations of this behavior and try to bring these things together. So we're just glimpsing at this, sort of for the first time. It's a great question.
Here's another one from Barback. Are there surgeon ants, or can any ant do an amputation?
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, so I think I don't answer, at least from my reading of the papers. I don't know, but it sounds like these are just nest mates, and in fact, they could take. You don't need the entire colony of ants to sort of pull this off. So they set up in some of their experiments. So they would they would set up, or do an injury, and then either put the ant back in isolation, so there's no chance of amputation, and measure how many would survive relative to the ants that are then put in subcolonies. So they would take 200, I think they're just other healthy worker ants, and then they're all kind of coming together. I don't think there are specialized surgeon ants in this case. This is something that they all do. I think that's similar for some of the antimicrobial stuff, right? So they have these specialized glands that then they're secreting and they're interacting with each other. And so this is a kind of a generalist, at least my impression as outsiders, these are generalist behaviors.
So when you put the ant, then whoever's closest to it will probably just do it.
Well, it's a great question. So how do they decide, right? Or how is it the nearest one? Are there multiple of ants? There's a lot under the hood here. And it's
for sure.
Yeah.
Here's some more. Yep. Here's another one from Joseph. Are they secreting some type of analgesic anesthetic?
I love this question. So I think the answer could be yes. I mean, they secrete all this other stuff. For the Florida ants, these ones, I mean, that's an interesting balance point here, which is, so they've lost, it's a specialized gland where a lot of species of ants will make antimicrobials, whether it's the leaf cutters that are putting it to keep their fungi clean, that they're putting the leaves onto, or they're feeding the fungi to the leaves, or the antimicrobial ones that are secreting so that they're doing wound care that way. But are there other? I would not be surprised, right? I mean, if the ant that's putting up with the amputation, is there something to sort of, calm them down or allow those hours of work to proceed, where you're literally have the mouth parts of your clone, your buddy, chewing away at your leg? That seems like a pretty invasive thing. Yeah. So great question. Yeah.
Here's another one. Well, Tona says, I bet exterminator companies need this information to get on top of new technology as the ants outsmart us.
Yeah, that's right. So,
maybe you could inhibit repair behavior in some way. And then Gary says, per Dr. Griffin, would the surgeon ants only read the abstract?
Well, there you go. That's right.
They would, if that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Maybe just the title. Who knows?
There you go. Yeah, the ants. We're all in this together.
Here's another funny one. Imagine telling someone you read ant CT scans for a living.
There you go. This is happening. So I think these are now the only two species that we know of that are conducting amputations. It's us and the ants, or a subset of the ants that do this. And so, obviously, so from an evolutionary standpoint, it wasn't that the common ancestor of ants and humans were doing amputations. This has become specialized behavior under very different scenarios, but seeing those same behaviors play out.
I thought there were some animals that would chew their own legs off.
Yeah,
right?
but I don't know if we distinguish self amputation, or the authors are distinguishing self amputation from
Someone else doing it.
yeah, exactly, allowing another member of individual in the population to do it. I think that might be the distinction there. Yeah, but of course, yeah, to escape if you're, bear in a trap or whatever it is.
Oh,
That's
remember the guy who got stuck between rocks somewhere out
oh my
west,
God, yeah,
and
that was here in southern Utah. Yeah, what's the
he
movie?
cut his
120 hours or 28 hours or something. Yeah,
he cut his leg off or something, or his arm. I don't remember which.
yeah, Arm. Yeah, that was. I remember. That movie is tough to watch. It's not like a horror movie in the sort of traditional sense, but seeing that agony over hours. But I mean, that's actually go watch that movie to get a sense of how incredible this ant behavior is. That they would, spend hours with each other, gnawing away at the trochanter
But
base of the
Nels,
leg.
do we know this happens in nature, not just in a lab?
Yeah, so that's so yes. So the difference between so it's pretty rare, right, to see a natural injury um, relative to an experimental injury, and so the authors were, I think, a little in the opening, just paragraph of the results
Hmm.
in discussion. The authors were slightly unclear about who is doing all of the manipulation here. Was it humans, or did they actually see ants themselves that were? How did they get to this? I think a little bit of that backstory would be useful here. But the other, sort of the other thread here that we should really bring in, I should have brought in earlier, is the infection. So the notion that the reason to amputate is because it would counter an infection. So obviously, just having a stub of a leg, there's no reason to amputate if there aren't, if that was, it's not hindering the ant from maneuvering to a large degree on the other 5 legs. But the notion is that there are infections that follow, and that's pretty clear from natural observations that they point to. But then they wanted to have some experimental control of that as well. And so what they did is they started culturing Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which has been as a pretty popular or successful, I should say, pathogenic bacteria in plants, insects, ants, other animals. And so so first they wanted to test, because no one had done this before for this species, if they just do an infection, so injure an ant. I think they did this at the tibia, the lower level, because of all of the access to the hemolymph. And then so they they injure those ants, treat them plus or minus either a sterile solution or I think 10,000 bacterial cells, and then let them go on, or keep them isolated. And 95% of those ants die of that infection. So very clear that there's a pathogenic outcome, or pathogenic outcome here, mortality related to that exposure. And so then they can set up the experiment, and here they did in a few different controlled settings. So they either injure the tibia or the femur, or the femur is the one where they do the amputations, and then they, after the injury and the exposure plus or minus bacteria, they either put them in that subcolony, so 200 nest mates, where the behavior will happen, or in isolation. And they immediately see a much lower survival in isolation. And these ants, they can't, probably because of the anatomy, can't do a self amputation here. Once they are injured and infected, it's sort of, they're swirling down the drain. But they did much better with the excuse me, with the as they're intervening with the experiments, and they describe this. Maybe this gets to your question a little bit, that they're mimicking sort of the natural cases that they actually see, and so and that's tucked into figure 3 there. So then, but to kind of confirm this, they started measuring pathogen load. So not only what's the sort of final outcome for survival, but if they amputate for the femur injuries, does that mean that there's lower bacteria load as the infection progresses? And the answer is pretty clearly yes. And so this sort of connects some of the dots for sort of the source of this behavior. So I think it was a couple of questions have already arisen, but this would added another question for me, which is, are they sensing the presence? Is part of the behavior here, or the decision making on whether to amputate, whether there's bacteria there or not. And so the authors test this, and it turns out if there's not bacteria, they're less likely to amputate, or sorry, other way around. Whether there's bacteria or not, they're still going to amputate. And so the idea is that there's, bacteria like Pseudomonas and other bugs are so prevalent in these colonies that sort of possibility of not only being a surgeon, but also a microbiologist doesn't look like, for at least this behavior, that it comes into play. There's no reason, like evolution hasn't sort of added that extra layer of complexity. They're not deciding, okay, well, there's no infection here, let's just leave the stump. As soon as there's an injury, it's like, okay, there's going to be a problem, we're amputating. So that's, I think that's sort of, I'm probably not explaining that too clearly, but the layers of the complexity that you can sort of peel apart with some relatively simple experiments. That's sort of the power of the system and of the work here. And then I think what you can do then is build from those observations, as you've sort of defined the behavior really closely, to manipulate it in ways that get you closer to having access. You have a few breadcrumbs for trying to connect that ultimately to what's encoding these behaviors. What's the genetics of this? What's the neural circuitry of these behaviors? Okay, so we already showed the CT scans, the CAT scans of the.
Anything else we should show
of the hemolymph?
It's a figure. It's a figure sparse paper, right? It's not a lot.
Well, it's kind of, that's the
4
punch.
figures.
Is these ants, these Florida carpenter ants, are doing this work. They're doing amputations, and so they're not sensing the infection. And by the way, other species do when they're deciding whether to treat with the antimicrobials that are in the glands, whether to sort of deploy those resources. In those cases, the ants are acting like microbiologists. They're determining whether there's the presence of these things where the antimicrobial intervention might help. And that's not the case in these amputating Florida carpenter ants. And so some delineating the behaviors here.
So remind me, Nels, is there a queen ant in the colony? I don't remember. Yes?
I think so. They don't mention it. I'm guessing there is. And that's a perfect example. The question came up about, are these specialized surgeons? I think in this case, they're just generalists, but there's all kinds of specialization. The most obvious, right, is the queen ant, who's both, the behavior of giving birth to every single ant in the colony is pretty different than the worker ant. So that those divisions of labor. Yeah. But here, I just wonder if the worker is part of being a worker.
I wonder if the queen ant would get some special treatment, if the queen injured her leg compared to the rest of the crowd,
Great question. So I just don't know enough. This is where, This Week in Ants, if we had Corey Moreau here, she could really teach us the ropes of, or Dustin or Eric Frank, obviously.
Maybe Eric, because I think it's pretty specialized. You need to be working on ant limb surgery to know this.
Sounds specialized. I mean, I think I'm sort of guessing that this is a generalized behavior, but that's obviously something that's testable. If you put a bunch, right, you start labeling the ants, which people do routinely, even with barcodes on the backs of the ants. There's ways to follow individuals over time and to ask, are there, sort of specialized, are there surgeons in this society, in addition to or not just sort of your everyday worker ants? I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question.
Got a couple of new people show up here. Tracy from Chapel Hill, -5. Pretty chilly. Pretty chilly down there.
Definitely for Chapel Hill.
Elizabeth, first-time attendee, long-time listener.
Fantastic.
Elizabeth often comes to office hours.
Very cool. Thanks for your question.
Abdul Rahman is in Albany, which is
welcome.
I bet very cold there as well. And Abdur Degifur is from Ethiopia. Welcome.
Fantastic.
It's pretty far away. Pete is from London. Welcome, Pete.
Welcome.
And the movie is 127 hours, and
there it is. Yeah,
it was hand. It was the hand that they.
Oh man, that is a tough movie to watch. Creepy.
And John,
real story.
John says some gray-haired ant. We called it amputation before humans came along. Indeed.
That's right.
It's good.
That's great. Good stuff. So that's it, Vincent. I think, so kind of hinting at this for me, the excitement ahead would be if, and I just don't know for the system, but sort of the Daniel Cronauer treatment, right? Is it possible to get some of the CRISPR related tools into this? So I don't know exactly the right, genes to start chipping away at to see how that alters the behavior.
That would be tough.
Yeah, it could be tough. But the fact that the behavior seems pretty, stereotypical, and pretty binary. You have this injury, 75 for 3/4, we're doing the amputation, pretty clean phenotype. And so, there's some obvious, I think, things to start to knock down. So orco, one of the sort of base of the olfactory reception, is olfaction involved in this. So it doesn't appear to be for like sensing whether there's an infection or not, but is there some quality to as they're licking the wound, for example, are they gauging how much hemolymph is exposed or not exposed? Is that in the decision-making process? And so, starting to genetically chip away at some of the senses, which would then be sort of the first input into the neural circuits to then start to tease this apart. And then if that's your entree, if that's successful, and then so there's now at really high resolution for some insects like fruit flies, Drosophila, we know how these circuits are where the position of every cell of these neural circuits is positioned. And so, to start to transpose that to the ants or develop those tools, then could be useful to start to get an idea of sort of how the signaling is taking place. And then that might be enough to get a foothold to then start to knock out some of the genes that are specific to some of these specialized cells or neurons, et cetera, and to kind of go from there. And so this is sort of the reductionists' strategy to teasing this apart, and where if and how that works relative to the complexity of the behavior. But that's where I'd say the field of behavioral evolution is sort of grappling right now. And one of the big challenges is usually the behaviors are pretty complex and sort of slippery. And so having a really clean phenotype or a clean amputation in this case is I think a big advantage or strength of this system, thinking about it going forward.
So Barb wants to know how big a genome ants have.
Ooh, great question. I knew the answer to this at some point. It depends obviously on the species of ants. They're relatively big, but not. My memory is that they're not human genome big. I think they're closer to fruit flies.
Between 200 and 700 megabases. Not huge.
So we're at 3 gigabases. So the human genome is about between 10 to 5 to 10 times bigger, I would say. Yep.
I was just looking up that, and then one of the answers had to do with cordyceps, right? Those ants, they get the fungal infection and it's things. So why don't the ants fix that?
Yeah, that's another really interesting. So here the behavior is microbial controlled, or microbial manipulation of behavior, right? So as the cordyceps, this fascinating fungi, infects in some cases the brain of the ants, they change the ants' behavior, right? And so the ants will, for example, climb to the top of a branch or whatever it is, and their mouth parts will just seize onto the thing. And then as the ant dies of the infection, then the fungal horns sort of emerge from it and broadcast all the spores. Yeah, so that's very weird. So I think the answer, though, is probably maybe there are some ants that do intervene and stop that. We just haven't seen it yet, right? So we just, for the first time here it was reported to us in July of 2024, the ants amputate their injured legs in some species. I bet there's ants out there that are, or that would be the idea of these sort of microbial conflicts, that then there's a possibility that there are some species or populations that have adapted just by, sort of trial and error, but it's just hard to see that because it just looks like, the reason we know that cordyceps works is such a dramatic sort of like fungal antler phenotype with dead ants all over. But if the ants are successful, then we just wouldn't see it. But yeah, I think there are a range of
things that could be fixed by other ants, right? This is easy to measure in the lab, the amputation, the injuring of a leg, but there are many other things that you could imagine. Worker comes back to the colony behaving a little weird, and they can smell something and they say, "Oh, you have this. We're going to take care of you." And they feed them some extract of a leaf. Who knows, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's just, tip of the iceberg here. There's no veterinarians of ants And so the more we observe as naturalists observe this, the more we learn about some of these behaviors, and that's what you hope for, is really good, clean phenotypes for complexity of behaviors. And obviously, the honeybees are another sort of exemplar of complex behavior as they build hives, make honey, interact with each other. They're dealing with microbes as well, and sort of complex social colonies.
So Tryon wants to know how much humans are related to ants genetically.
Yeah, very distantly. So, I don't have off the, at my fingertips sort of estimates of how many years since last common ancestor. But this is what's really clear is that, the sort of our last common ancestor would be a species that was very well. I don't know. It was if it was practicing amputation, that wasn't something that just sort of continued through all animal lineages. There's the vast majority of animals that don't exhibit this behavior. And so again, so as an evolutionist, you want to find the close, like now that you've discovered this behavior, who is the closest known relative of the carpenter ants that don't do this behavior? That gives you sort of the cleanest evolutionary view of when this arose and sort of what are the genetic differences.
His Barmack says no veterinarians of ants yet.
That's right.
Yeah.
I guess you could say that these folks are, like, if you're an aspiring ant veterinarian, right? This is like there's half the pile of grad school applications are people like me who grew up with magnifying glasses, like not veterinarians of ants, but messing with ants, just sort of that inherent curiosity to manipulate or understand what's going on.
Let's see. John writes, I wonder if whatever triggers this amputation behavior can accidentally get out of control, like a cancer, but triggering amputations that don't need to happen.
Yeah, great. This is great. And so, and already the fact that they're seem to be discerning between the femur versus the tibia, the level of, that's one of the surprising things, right? Is the ability of the sensory systems, whether that's olfaction, feel, as visual cues, all of the environmental cues that the worker ants are sensing and interpreting. And so, the simplest evolutionary model is that if there was a colony where if that sort of the sensory behavior was altered, that could be possible. Not clear how many mutations away you would be from losing control of that sort of discerning situation. But then the idea would be, if now this is sort of runs out of control and it impacts the ability of the colony to reproduce, right? And so if they're running in and amputating all the appendages of the queen ant, this is something that would be squelched pretty fast because there's not a next generation, basically. But if it's something that's happening out at the periphery, or it's just a few worker ants, how much, that's a great question. I don't know the answer is how much sort of, how many mistakes can you tolerate before it starts to weigh on the fitness of the colony? And so not just the individual, but if you can imagine, I think pretty easily, that if everyone started amputating each other's legs, pretty soon the work that the workers are doing, gathering resources for the colony, ultimately for the queen, would break down pretty quickly. And so then evolution would test very naturally that scenario, but then those populations wouldn't persist very long. And so that's sort of what would help sculpt some of that discernment. And that's what's really wild about evolution, is then as these processes continue to unfold, how, really down to the fine detailed level of discerning the injury type, seems like it's enough of an advantage. It's adaptive enough that these are then, that complexity or that behavior continues to develop, because these are the populations that just do a little better relative. They're less likely to crash, or they deal with infections better than sort of the neighboring colonies. And then these are the ones that sort of take over, in this case in Florida and, Southeast US.
All right, this one is a little outside of our paper, but it's real.
Yeah.
FSM, the dog. Anything been said about CDC being instructed to pause all external comms? The administration has it directed all federal health agencies to stop communicating.
Yeah, this is pretty wild, right? So, I mean, actually, we'll probably start our transition here into our picks of the week and maybe talk a little bit about what some current events here. But it's a great question, sort of in light of the paper that we're just talking about. What are the ants doing here as it relates to infectious microbes? They're working with each other to block them from impacting or causing negative outcomes for the colony. What do we usually do as humans? We use our brains and our ability to communicate to tell each other, hey, there's a lot of infections happening here. We might want to intervene or stay clear of each other. This is sort of, I think we'll see how, at the very least, this is, in my opinion, is pretty sloppy, government efficiency, to say the least. This is like to shut down, like we have all of these important, vital, crucial lines of communication from the CDC, from the NIH, related governmental agencies to help compare notes about who are the microbes that we're up against at any one moment. We've got H5N1 flu doing natural experiments every day at the moment. And at least today, as of this podcast, as of this morning, those updates aren't being shared publicly with scientists, with public health officials. And so we're doing a pretty weird experiment here in shutting down some of our ability to communicate and do better against infectious microbes. I mean, the ants would be laughing at us at our sort of behaviors here. So at the best,
Go ahead.
The best, this is sort of sloppy, administrative transitions. At the worst, we're now sort of working against our best impulses to share information. And, let's have those discussions. Is the right information getting out? Why is this the right information? That's, I think, the opportunity here is, as some of the things that we sort of take for granted as just regular public health interventions or just operations, as those go away, and we see, I think that's part of the job of scientists, public health officials, is we have to illustrate why these things are important that we've taken for granted and might be under attack.
So this includes, all the U.S. The Department of Health and Human Services, like FDA and NIH, CDC. They've been asked to pause external communications, including scientific reports, updates to websites, health advisories. They routinely release information like on food recalls, drug and medical devices, updates on evolving public health threats, natural disasters, infectious diseases like H5N1. They can't do that. And I don't know how long it's going to be. And I don't understand why you would do that, except that you have no idea how public health works. And you're just playing politics.
Yeah, playing politics seems like the easiest explanation, along with a pretty disorganized transition, not sort of valuing or understanding the value of these lines of communication. It's really this is what we're in. We're just starting to get a taste of in ways that are going to be far-reaching. And, we're in the first, whatever this is, 24 hours, 48 hours of this administration, we're already seeing some really signs of things going in a really confusing, awful direction. I don't know. Did you catch, Vincent? There was I don't usually tune in, but the National Prayer Service, actually, there was a homily by like an Episcopal minister, Marianne Budd, and really interesting to hear her talk about, given that the current president made a point in his inaugural address that he feels like God intervened on his behalf.
Yeah, right.
Her point was that, here's what God says about various things as it relates to community, as it relates to unity. And wow, the contrast in what is happening at the government level versus, some of these time-honored messages from religious backgrounds. It's the contrast is really striking.
As far as I understand, I'm not a religious person, but religion is about kindness to humanity. And that's not what this administration is showing. This administration is showing selfishness,
to say the least. It's echoing in many directions at the moment. And so the plea here was that for people in our country, populations of people, whether LGBTQ plus, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, that there's a lot of populations of scared people. And if you're going to invoke the providence of a higher being, that, there's more that comes along with that than just sort of your own selfish interest.
Tryon wants to know if ants develop autoimmune illness. That's a good question.
Yeah, I think the answer is probably yes. So this is ants have immune systems like other insects and animals, like all animals, and that balance between intervening. So now at a more molecular level or immunological level, as opposed to behavioral level, you can imagine that there are courses of where you adapt to block infectious microbes, but then that sort of these overexuberant responses could then lead to autoimmunity, the immune system attacking the ant's own sort of organ systems, et cetera. Absolutely. And so, we know the most about autoimmunity, obviously, in humans and the model system mice, but insect immunity is really interesting, complex, and a lot to learn.
It's mainly RNA based, right?
Can be. Yep, exactly. RNAi. But there's also, signaling closer to what a lot of RNA signaling. So TLR, the toll-like receptors that are sensing microbial patterns and then kicking off immune responses. And also small RNAs that are directly targeting the nucleic acids of viruses and other infectious microbes. Yep. Great question.
Nels, you want to do some picks?
Yeah, let's move into our science picks of the week. So I'll start. So I've got I've been looking for sort of signs of inspiration here, and so in the realm of science, I think I've got one here, Vincent. So think globally, podcast locally. Where am I finding hope these days? There's a new podcast called The Science Bridge. This is from a group of 3 grad students at the University of Colorado Anschutz campus. Davey Rao, Lauren Dunn, and Ginny Fogg. And so I met Ginny. I was giving a seminar at Anschutz. So this is in Aurora, Colorado, a couple months ago. And over lunch, we were talking about science communication, science outreach. And Ginny shared with me that she and a couple of her colleagues had been recording a podcast. And I'm happy to report that they just posted their first episode last week. I've got to have a link that we'll put up on our Microbe TV channels here. And so their goal that they outline in their first episode is to share science without jargon. And so the Science Bridge is part of sort of a group at Colorado Anschutz. So this is the medical school for the University of Colorado. And they have a small organization called Project Bridge. I think this actually started at maybe Johns Hopkins on the East Coast 10 years ago. But it's really organized around promoting local science outreach. So to the community of Denver and Aurora, what's going on in these laboratories, and to share. So they're, have been sort of picking up the work of their own work, the work of their colleagues, some of the institutes and medical centers, and starting to share that. And they're doing it by podcasting. And I got to tell you, Vincent, I just listened to the first few minutes, but so it's up on Spotify. They've got a great theme music. It all just started. They've got the podcast going, and so there's already. We were discussing last time this Google AI that does these fake podcasts. The real ones are so much better. And hats off to Davey, Lauren, and Ginny as they're launching the Science Bridge.
That's cool. Very good.
Yeah. How about you, Vincent? What's your science pick of the week?
So my pick is the White House document withdrawing. So it's a presidential action, executive order issued on January 20th, withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization. So I put a link to it in the chat so you can go see it. It's like, for such a momentous thing, it's like a 1-page document, right? So why would we withdraw from WHO? So the reason, which is put forward in this document, U.S. notices its withdrawal from WHO. In 2020, we did this.
Yeah, it's not the first time, right?
No, it's not the first time. Due to mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, failure to adopt urgently needed reforms, inability to demonstrate independence from the inappropriate political influence of WHO member states. And the WHO continues to demand unfairly onerous payments from the U.S. And they say China pays a lot less, 90% less, and they have many more people than we do. And that's pretty much it. We intend to withdraw from WHO as of now for the same reasons.
Yeah.
And so what does this mean? That's the thing. Do people actually know what WHO is and what it does? So World Health Organization is a global entity which is supported by the nation members, right? You give them money, they charge you dues, and they use the money to do their operations. They have headquarters in Geneva. They have a lot of people working for them, assessing things related to health. So,
Yes.
for example, if there's an outbreak, they provide information, ongoing information about the outbreak that can be used by nations to respond. We will
Yes.
no longer get that information because we quit WHO. And it seems to me that this is a typical administration thing. They're going to punish you for what they perceive as wrongdoings. So they say, mishandling COVID-19. Everybody made mistakes during the pandemic. It doesn't mean you have to quit. You could just send them a letter saying, we noticed these things and we'd like to help you improve them, right?
Yeah.
And also the idea about the dues being too much. We'll discuss it with them. Quitting is not the solution. I mean, they do perform a valuable task, especially for nations that can't do their own health care, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But we need the information about, the spread of COVID variants, SARS-CoV-2 variants, for example. We're not going to get that anymore. Or anything about H5N1. We're not going to get it. So this is really dumb. It's basically a science stupid move to make some political statement. Right.
Yep.
And
I hear you.
It's gross.
I agree. Well, and it just, I mean, on many levels. So infectious microbes don't care about the borders between countries. I would say these investments that the U.S. makes, even though it might be more than China, the value that you potentially get from those investments. It's a bargain versus going through, like, imagine another pandemic, SARS-3 arrives and runs, loose for an extra month before sort of the information sharing happens. There could be trillions of dollars of disruption to society, even in those short timeframes, as we're pretty accustomed to from SARS-2. And so, this idea of kind of, it's just reckless is what it feels like to me. And that's not to say that, organizations can't do better or that we can't improve things. We should, but it's just the means that we do it. And so this sort of, my way or the highway, or this sort of, pseudo negotiating that's going on here for outcomes that aren't clear, the whole thing feels really reckless. And we did this last time. And so, I think we're all trying to gauge where do we put our resources to countering this? What are this notion of flooding the zone with garbage. And then, that makes it harder to sort of counter this in effective ways. And so, these are, at least from the science perspective, I'm seeing a lot of nonsense again even within a short amount of time since the administrations have changed.
Well, that's going to be the hallmark of the next 4 years. Nonsense.
Yeah.
And doesn't make any sense.
Nonsense and recklessness are the two that come immediately to mind to me.
Peter says the orange god still feels upset that people blamed him for COVID deaths. So go find someone else to blame. I think he basically lost to Biden because of COVID, because he mismanaged COVID. I mean, look, he said in like the first month, it'll soon be over.
Yeah, I remember those. I was in Washington, D.C. at study section, and I watched one of these press conferences of recklessly saying, oh yeah, we're in control of this. This whole thing is going to, in a week or two, we'll have it'll be small. We'll have all the cases solved.
To say that is just reckless.
Yeah.
And at the same time, by the way, John Ioannidis, this Stanford professor who is always on about how science is reproducible, he mocked people who said there would be hundreds of thousands of deaths. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you were wrong, John, mocking people, because it turned out there were many, many more deaths than anyone could predict. And this is the
Yeah.
problem. Nobody knows what's going to happen early in a pandemic. And so to make proclamations is upset. This is the problem I have with Bhattacharya, the nominee for NIH. You know,
Oh
he
yeah.
signed
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
signed on to this Great Barrington Agreement, which
Right.
said, well, it's not going to be a problem. We don't have to mask. We don't have to lock down. How do you know? How do you know it's a brand new infectious agent and you didn't know that it was going to cause long COVID and a lot of people got it? So what do you think about that? Why aren't you more cautious in the beginning in the absence of knowledge? That's what science is about. This guy cannot be head of NIH. He doesn't get what science is.
Yeah, no, I agree that I'm not a fan of the Great Barrington Declaration, which has some of these hallmarks of recklessness here. I think the irony with the COVID scenario as it relates to Trump is that in terms of getting the vaccine from sequence to effective vaccine, this is like a moon landing moment in
Yes.
terms, right, for a government delivering on something in a timely way. And to go from, absolutely stumbles, public health sort of guidance stumbles along the way, but to go from the pandemic with this much of a negative impact on health and, and millions of lives lost to a safe vaccine that's effective to be able to reopen. I think we undervalue under the watch of the Trump administration with all spouting all that nonsense, but under the surface, that progress to develop a vaccine that turned the tide and allowed us to reopen, sometimes pretty predictable stumbling and learning as we go ways. But that is a huge success. The irony is he can't, as much as he likes to take credit, he can't call this the Trump vaccine. He can do the Trump tennis shoe. He can't do the Trump vaccine because of all of the, sort of nonsense that is twisted around what public health means.
Yeah.
And so, not a free check, free lunch for just let's experiment on each other and amputate legs and try unsafe vaccines, but in some pretty time-honored traditional ways, back from polio and before, public health is building off of all of this, all these foundations, these solid foundations that are then, being transferred onto these sandy foundations of nonsense, recklessness, and all of the above. Wild days, to say the least.
Tona writes, I don't know the history of how many years it took to develop WHO, but for him to dissolve our participation with the stroke of a pen is gut-wrenching. In fact, I don't think that a president should be allowed to do something like this. I think it should at least require a vote of Congress. Like one person decides we're not going to do. No, that's ridiculous. It's like a dictatorship. But
yes, similar with the Paris Agreement, the climate stuff. And again, not a perfect treaty, but at least acknowledging what we're up against and some framework to work together beyond. That's what one of the big changes, right, in U.S. Sort of style or policy that we're back into is the whole go it alone versus that there's value beyond our own borders. And I don't think we're going to solve it on today's TWiEVO, but we've covered some important ground.
Yeah, we're not going to solve it, but we have to talk about it.
We do, exactly, and continue and talk together about it. Compare notes. What are we seeing? What are ways to communicate what's happening and to communicate, the value of what science is trying to do.
Oh, yeah. One more thing I wanted to say. Can you believe that Biden had to pardon Tony Fauci, among others? I mean, isn't that ridiculous?
God. Yeah.
To think that he would have been prosecuted in this, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And here, the strategy isn't that Fauci is going to, I guess you never know with the set of judges it goes in front of. There's no legal basis for any of this, but there's the pathway to just throw all this garbage at people now. And so, the fact that I was curious to see, that's been hinted at for the last few weeks that he might do some pardons along these lines. And so that was sort of, for me at least, was a moment where, things are, the perception of what's going on in Washington is pretty serious about the impulses of this current administration to go after and attack people in new ways that are serving the public, and have for decades against. I mean, that's the wild thing to me, right? Is who do I see, or what do I see as some of the challenges we're up against? Pandemics, HIV, influenza, coronavirus, SARS. Those feel to like, as I think about our community of people, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or independents, some of our shared challenges are infectious microbes. And so the fact that we're starting to, I mean, if I was a pandemic virus, I would be so happy with what's going on now, with all these hosts sort of fighting with each other and opening the door for the ability to replicate and spread more freely under sort of the cover of misinformation and arguing, bickering, political power. These are wild days.
And by the way, the things that Biden pardoned, these are preemptive pardons, because there's no, a normal presidential pardon is when someone has been convicted, and you pardon them, and if they're in jail, they get to come out of jail. But that is an admission of guilt. However, there's no guilt here because there's nothing charged yet. This is something new. It's a predictive pardon to see.
Yeah.
If the idea is if somebody sues Tony next year, he's automatically protected, right? But he hasn't been sued yet.
That's right. I mean, that's the downside. Is then, of course, the politics is, oh well, he must have done something wrong if he was pardoned, and then it just starts to spiral potentially again.
Yeah, many of these pardon, as FSM said, many were already in jail. But I like the grandmother who said, I don't accept the pardon. She was one of the January 6th convictees. She spent her time in jail. She said, it was wrong what we did. We shouldn't be pardoned. Yes. So she turned down the pardon. That was great.
These are the sparks of hope. This is what I'm looking for and excited about. Are exactly this woman, I think she's 71, retired, lives in Idaho, said, you know what? I'm not taking the pardon. Good for her. Like, this is like, there are these just hints of why the U.S. is a great place. It's just all here. And so I'm really hoping that we're able to tap into that and
hopefully
in new ways moving forward, but not to downplay the headwinds that are pretty clear and swirling in a lot of confusing and troubling ways.
All right, let's end on a good note. Thank you, Brendan, for your support of science communication. Brendan's from Salt Lake City. There you go. We appreciate your support. All right, that's TWiEVO 110. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiEVO. If you enjoy these programs, we'd love your support. Microbe.tv/contribute. Nels Eldy is at cellvolution.org and Early Bird on Blue Sky. Thank you, Nels.
Thank you, Vincent. Great to be together. Great to be podcasting together, and looking forward to TWiEVO 111.
Hopefully at 1 p.m. Eastern, right?
1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to move back to our regular patterns.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. Thank you, Barb Mack, for moderating today. Barb Mack did it all by herself. Actually, no, Barb Mack and Vanity Nutrition. Thank you, too, for moderating. There was a little bit of a disturbance in the force, so thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
For being here. And thanks, everyone else, for coming. Tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, we have Office Hours, my solo thing where I just talk about stuff that you want to know. And we're going to get Nels back on Office Hours one of these nights. You like that, so
for sure.
I'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And we will be back in about a month, right? So we do these once a month. You've been the music you hear on TWiEVO, by the way, is by Trampled by Turtles. You can find them at trampledbyturtles.com. You've been listening to This Week in Evolution, the podcast on the biology behind what makes us tick. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next month. Till then, be curious. Bye-bye.